Urban periphery is used to describe the South African township, dormitory suburbs that were conceived during apartheid to accommodate non-white communities in areas far removed from urban and economic nodes. Since the transition into a democratic society, efforts have been made to redress the imbalance of cultural capital in these areas. The museum as an institution and architectural typology has featured prominently as a device to achieve this since 1994. Tembisa, the specific township or periphery explored in this investigation, is the second largest township in South Africa by population. While this township is yet to receive sustained cultural interventions like older and more prominent townships, for example Soweto, a museum is high on the agenda for this region. This investigation examines, critiques, and conceives an inclusive narrative for a new type of museum space appropriate for this context. This exploration originated as an architectural dissertation. It has since been subjected to a cross-pollination with ideas found in the fields of history and memory, museology, anthropology, and sociology. One such idea is Lefebvre's notions of the production of new space. Lefebvre considers space to be the direct product of the humans that inhabit it. For Lefebvre, space is not an isolated construct that is rigidly produced through its own devices, but is instead variously produced through the actions of the human occupants who engage with it on a daily basis. In light of this, I would like to consider the museum as a truly inclusive public construct that is defined and shaped by contextual circumstances, a type of institution that is closely associated with issues concerning public life, collective memory, communal values, and environmental challenges. The spatialization of museum narratives in contemporary South Africa is often presented as a grand container of a master narrative. These institutions often miss the opportunity to be conduits that perpetuate and contribute to the township's own evolving narrative. The Red Location Museum is one such example. The premise of this museum is to celebrate the immediate context as a stronghold of the liberating political party, the ANC. Many of the contextual stories that might exist within the community are secondary to this grand political narrative, and what results is a museum in which the voices of the wide public are viewed through a specific master narrative. The Hector Peterson Museum in Soweto is a grand monument that reprises the events of June 16, 1976. This museum and its static narrative is celebrated with much vigor around the time of its anniversary, but it struggles to remain relevant to the everyday realities of the immediate surrounds. This critique is not an oversimplified rejection of the status quo. Instead, it is an attempt at broadening the scope and narrative of the contemporary South African museum to encompass a more inclusive agenda. In the case of Tembisa, history, heritage, and culture are the three ingredients or artifacts necessary for the production of a new type of museum space. Consider this gully, a natural feature that cuts across the proposed location of the new museum. Over time, water has eroded the earth to reveal layers of soil once hidden to plain sight. This process is an ideal metaphor for my intention to create a museum that exposes cultural, heritage, and historical characteristics of Tembisa. While searching for info on the historical landscape of Tembisa, my biggest source was human interactions with residents of the township. The history of Tembisa and many similar township contexts, although poorly documented, remains a great and untapped resource currently in possession of the local communities and individuals. What if the museum took on the role of an easily accessible device that collects, preserves, and presents diverse local histories and memories? Historical theorists present history, much like a puzzle, as the factual recreation of what is no longer. This recreation, however, is often flawed and incomplete. When in the possession of those wielding political power, history can be biased, propagandist, and elite. Memory positions itself directly against the clear bias of history and, much like a series of fluctuating layers, elevates the individual and emotional, subjective recollection of past events. Pia Nora tells us that the notions of history and memory, although distinctly different, need not be oppositional, but are inherently entangled. So what then is the middle ground between history and memory in a new museum space? Consider this retaining wall found in Tembisa along the main bus route. What was initially a concrete retaining wall has over time become a canvas which residents have repurposed for their varying needs. In some parts, this wall is used as a container of factual and finite stories, i.e., adverts and communal messages. In other parts, it's used as an ever-changing canvas that local artists use for everyday expression. What if the museum for this context took on similar characteristics? A type of wall that is willing to accept, interpret, preserve, and present a varying collection of narratives and stories, a kind of palimpsest that retains its historical value while allowing itself to be further eroded through everyday use. Remember that gully on my proposed site? It is a serious environmental challenge requiring urgent attention. In engineering, a rock wall is a tool that negates the effects of erosion, while in architecture, rock walls, or gabions, can be used to enclose space. Much like the idea of the wall as a metaphor for history and memory, the wall can also take on a multiplicity of functions. Think back to Maya Lin's Vietnam Memorial. In layman's terms, this is simply a wall cut into the landscape. However, beyond this basic definition is a simple yet profound memorial that is a moving container of history and memory. History professor Chris Saunders tells us that heritage is a recreation of the past, an act of remembrance. According to him, heritage also includes what is created in the present to remember the past by. The heritage industry in post-apartheid South Africa, usually driven by commercial objectives, has boomed since 1994. This raises the question of considering heritage as a more interactive arm of a reconsidered museum. A heritage present in Tembisa is that of Tami Mnyele. Tami Mnyele was a prolific artist and creative liberator who was raised in Tembisa before practicing his craft while in exile in Botswana during the height of the oppressive apartheid regime. While in exile, he was a prominent member of the Medu art ensemble. Medu is a Sepedi word for roots. Other than being a talented artist, he also used his skills to perpetuate consciousness in black societies. His legacy in Tembisa largely lives on for political grandstanding, with monuments and naming practices used as a means to reprise this heritage. Instead of continuing along this trajectory and proposing a traditional museum as a monument to an individual, I would like to envisage the museum as an institution that is in part fashioned by the inclusive practices of Medu. By doing this, the museum is also a place of creation, a container that can accommodate a variety of artistic pursuits. The content produced within the confines of this museum become living and active artifacts created and displayed within the specific context. This in part also presents the museum as an intervention that seeks to address the severe lack of creative infrastructure in the immediate context. Of the many schools in the surrounding area, none of the schools examined have the capacity to provide children with a substantial creative education. Imagine a museum that is a necessity to the everyday functioning of a community. The final artifact considers how notions of culture can be condensed into a new type of museum space. While you and I may have different cultural beliefs, what is common between our perceptions of culture is the need to actively practice and produce these notions to avoid cultural inertia. Considering culture as something that we do is an intriguing prospect. Taking you back to the proposed site for the new museum, we find an existing natural underwater stream, or to give it its Zulu name, Isiziba. Commonly referred to by locals as the water of life, this natural occurrence manages to attract a diverse range of residents who gather around the rocky outcrop where it originates. Visitors to the stream partake in various forms of cultural production: ritualistic cleansing, contemplative meandering, introspective meditating, and quiet pondering. What if a museum for this context took on these type of characteristics. A blank canvas that allowed anyone and everyone, despite their beliefs, to partake in a form of cultural production. The museum then lends itself as a device that directs cultural capital in a bottom-up manner, able to be perpetuated through everyday actions. Patricia Davison, an expert in museology, states that there remains a surplus of meanings waiting to be made and remade. Museums hold and shape memory, but they cannot contain them. Considering this perspective, my vision for the museum can be described as the creation of anti-containers. Museums created in democratic South Africa have emphasized the production and perpetuation of finite and rigid narratives. What if the museums we create become devices that expose, expand, influence, and advance evolving narratives and ideas? The question of whose museum becomes one that is answered through the everyday production of contextually relevant artifacts for the people and by the people.